Many people say that a true sign of quality in a novel is whether you can read it over and over again. I'm sure the majority of you will have read your favourite novel or watched your favourite film or TV show many times over. You will know, therefore, that the way you experience the exact same words or the exact same scene is never quite the same. You may know that a character is going to die, but that same death can be felt in 100 different ways. It is with this in mind that I ask those of you who have read The House in Fata Morgana to reconsider this line said by the character of the Maid right at the start of the visual novel. Come now, you must gather yourself. Though I am glad to hear your voice, I have simply been waiting so long for this moment. But before we discuss the character of the Maid and why this character is so heartbreaking, I'd like to make clear that this video is going to have spoilers, and more spoilers. Because as a commenter on my first video well expressed, which only warned of spoilers in the description, no one reads the description, my guy. On a more serious note, I'd also like to thank people enormously for the response to my first video. If you want more Fata Morgana content, or video essays on anything, really, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and leave suggestions. Anyway, here is why the Maid breaks our hearts. One of the hardest moral questions posing a Christian view of our world is this: why do bad things happen to good people? This is a question which is just as integral to the visual novel Morgana. It is a tragedy not only where tragic things take place, but one which inquires into the meaning of these tragedies and whether anyone can be truly deserving of misfortune. Nowhere is the question more keenly felt than in the character of the Maid, and of course, the opposite side of that coin, Giselle. Because in truth, these are two different characters, each desperately trying to escape from the identity of the other, the Maid and Giselle. When we first meet the Maid, she is nothing more than a curiosity, one of the many mysteries that this gothic mansion we find ourselves in has set forth. The way the visual novel carefully peels away at these layers of mysteries, including that of the Maid, is masterful. The first 3 doors we experience in this game may be set in different time periods and focus on different topics, but the similarities between them become increasingly clear as each unfolds. As Michelle says later in the game, behind the 3 doors, there had been a constant thread of ugliness and conflicting motivations. But putting aside mere themes, the Maid is one of the only physical constants. Along with the ever-present white-haired girl, she is an anchor to the reader. She becomes a motif, a reassurance that there is some link, some deeper meaning, some catharsis to the overwhelming tragedy that us and the characters are forced to endure. This is what the House in Fata Morgana does so brilliantly. It understands that for these tragedies to mean something, we the readers have to feel them ourselves. Of course, in the first 3 doors, we are mere spectators. We only feel these tragedies on an empathetic level, an ultimately superficial one. As the Maid so eloquently observes, you were able to bear them because they weren't your tragedies. This all changes when, in the 4th and 5th door, we uncover one of the novel's greatest mysteries. Not only our identity, but Giselle's. In this way, the House in Fata Morgana binds the reader to Michelle and Giselle in a deeply personal way. Their tragedy is quite literally our tragedy. Their suffering is our suffering. You may have noticed that so far in this video, I've made a conscious effort to talk in the first person collective, in our and we. This is to show how effectively Morgana turns an impersonal story, one that takes place centuries adrift from us and our experiences into something very personal indeed. This is where a question I raised earlier also comes into play. Why do bad things happen to good people? The suffering felt by Giselle and the Maid is some of the most poignant and difficult to read in the entire visual novel. Why? Because of its total pointlessness. The character of Giselle so obviously does not deserve her tragedies that it's almost unbearable. She is a rarity in Morgana, a character that is almost completely virtuous and almost completely innocent. She may have made mistakes in her lifetime, like bringing the villagers to the mansion, but these pale in comparison to the sins of others in the novel. As such, our sympathy for Giselle is arguably stronger than for any other character. For me, one of the most affecting parts of the visual novel was the sixth door, the story of Giselle's transformation into the Maid. Giselle states before it begins that, "When you've heard it all, I expect you to commend me for not forgetting how to smile." This is proven wholeheartedly true. Seeing Giselle's predicament in waiting hundreds upon hundreds of years, in being given hope and then continually having it snatched away, is really difficult to watch. But a hallmark of good writing is making characters suffer. Otherwise, there can be no conflict, no catharsis. The transformation of Giselle into the Maid is a powerful piece of storytelling. It reflects one of the most difficult parts of overcoming tragedy: loss of identity. Everyone can relate to being changed, sometimes irrevocably, by suffering. The person you were before losing someone is not the same as the person after. This can be so hard to come to terms with. Giselle's suffering is so great that the only way she can deal with it is by suppressing who she was before. She must become the Maid, a shell of a human being. If she isn't human, the pointlessness of her tragedies, of her centuries of waiting, are now redundant. She no longer has to care. Giselle and the Maid are an example of one of the most human and damaging coping mechanisms for grief and suffering: denial. If a tragedy isn't yours, then you don't have to bear it. I said in my first video that the visual novel Morgana presents an ultimately optimistic interpretation of suffering. That interpretation is simple: that all suffering eventually ends with salvation. Here I'm going to let the visual novel speak for itself and provide its own catharsis. After all, the mark of a good novel is whether it can be read over and over again. I don't think many readers of this visual novel will protest to seeing this moment one more time.
Estou contando os dias que nós passamos. O que você esconde de toda calada não me deixa.
You only need to watch a playthrough of the house in Fata Morgana to see the effect that this moment has on people. This ending is an incredible example of long-term storytelling paying off in the most poignant and heartfelt way. It cuts so deep because the writer has ensured we feel every second, every year, every century of Giselle's waiting as keenly as she does. Think back to that moment right at the start of the visual novel. This millennium-long story begins and ends with Giselle. Or rather, it begins with the maid, and it ends with Giselle. Her suffering is ours, and her salvation right at the end is also ours.